I don't remember exactly when it started, but I do know I haven't slept through the night in weeks. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, like all the stuff kids see in movies and stories. But this felt different. It began with small things. A strange noise in the corner of my room, like the creaking of wood, even though nothing moved. I would lie in bed, staring at the darkness, telling myself it was just the house settling or the wind outside. But every night, the noises grew louder, more distinct. Scraping sounds like something dragging across the floor, and soft whispers, too faint to understand, but always there. I told Mom and Dad about it, of course. They said the same thing. It's just the wind, sweetheart. The house is old, and it makes noises at night. They didn't believe me. I could see it in their eyes, in the way they'd glance at each other when I talked. But I knew something was wrong. Then I saw it. Or rather, I felt it. One night, after lying awake for hours, I finally began to drift off, letting my eyes close against the weight of the dark. But just as I was about to fall asleep, I felt something shift near my bed. I shot up, heart pounding in my chest, my breathing heavy. My eyes scanned the room, trying to find what had changed, what had moved. And that's when I saw the shape. A shadow in the far corner, darker than the rest of the room. At first, it was just a faint blur, something I could almost pretend wasn't real. But then it grew sharper, more defined. It was tall, hunched, and though I couldn't see its face, I felt it staring at me, watching me. I bolted out of bed and ran down the hall as fast as my legs could carry me, barely able to catch my breath when I reached Mom and Dad's room. I threw open their door and jumped onto the bed, shaking, stammering that there was someone in my room. Dad grumbled, groggy, and pulled me close, muttering something about bad dreams and going back to sleep. But it wasn't a dream. I know it wasn't. The next few nights, I refused to sleep alone. Every time Mom and Dad tried to tuck me back in my room, I would run out as soon as the lights went out. They didn't understand, and I couldn't explain it properly, but I just knew something was there. Something wrong. I would stand in the doorway of their room, holding my blanket tight, waiting for them to say I could stay. Sometimes they'd let me curl up at the foot of their bed. Other times they'd sigh and walk me back to my room, turning on a night light and leaving the door open. But no matter what they did, it didn't change the fact that the shadow was there. And it was getting bolder. One night, after they walked me back for the 5th time, I lay under my blanket, eyes wide open, watching the shadow. It wasn't in the corner anymore. It had moved closer, closer to the foot of my bed. I could barely breathe, too scared to scream, too terrified to move. The shadow seemed to pulse, like it was alive, like it was growing larger with every beat of my heart. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying it would go away, that I would wake up and it would all just be a nightmare. But when I opened them again, it was even closer. I could see the outline of its hands, long and twisted, hanging at its sides. The air around me felt colder, like something was draining the warmth out of the room. That's when I heard it. The whisper, clearer this time. "Come closer," it said, in a voice that sounded like rustling leaves and cracked bones. My heart stopped. I didn't want to move, but my body betrayed me. My hand twitched, like something was pulling me towards the edge of the bed. That was the first night I heard the voice. The first night I knew for certain that the shadow wasn't just a part of my imagination. I couldn't take it anymore. I ran faster than I ever had before, bursting into my parents' room, screaming that the figure was in my room, that it was real. This time, Dad didn't just grumble. He sat up, rubbing his face, and glanced at Mom. She looked at me with concern, finally understanding that I wasn't just having nightmares. But when they went to check, the shadow was gone. The next morning, After what felt like the longest night of my life, Mom said she would stay with me in my room until I fell asleep. Dad didn't say much, but I could tell they were both worried. They thought it was all in my head, that maybe I was just stressed or had seen something on TV that scared me. But they couldn't see what I saw. They didn't hear the whispers. That night, Mom stayed true to her word. She sat beside my bed, stroking my hair, whispering soft words to calm me down. I wanted to believe that having her there would make a difference, that the shadow wouldn't come back if I wasn't alone. But as soon as the lights were off and the room grew quiet, I knew it was still there. I could feel it. It was waiting. Mom fell asleep before I did, her breathing soft and steady. I kept my eyes open, watching the dark corners of the room. Minutes passed, hours maybe, and then it happened. The shadow slid out from the wall just like before. But this time it didn't stop at the foot of my bed. It moved closer, so close I could feel the cold radiating from it. I stared at it, frozen, unable to look away. It leaned over me, its outline clearer than ever, and I could finally see its face, or at least where a face should have been. There were no eyes, no mouth, just darkness. But I heard the whisper, right in my ear. You can't hide forever. This time I didn't scream. Couldn't. I was too afraid to make a sound. Too afraid that it would do more than just watch me if I moved. And as I lay there, paralyzed, I knew. It didn't just want to scare me. I don't know how long I lay there, staring at the shadow looming over me. Time didn't feel real in that moment. It was like the world outside my room had stopped existing. All that mattered was the figure and the growing weight in my chest. I was suffocating under its presence, under the certainty that it wanted something from me. I didn't tell Mom what happened that night. I wanted to, but every time I thought about describing the figure, the words caught in my throat. Something about saying it out loud felt wrong, like it would make it stronger. Instead, I just nodded when she asked if I had slept, pretending everything was fine. But inside, I was shaking. That morning, I overheard my parents talking in the kitchen. I wasn't supposed to hear them, but their voices carried through the hallway. Maybe we should take him to someone, Mom whispered. A therapist or, I don't know. He's not acting like himself anymore. He barely talks and he's so pale all the time. Dad didn't answer right away. Kids have nightmares, Marie. He'll grow out of it. What if it's more than that? What if... Mom stopped when she saw me standing in the doorway. She forced a smile, trying to hide the worry in her eyes. But I could still see it. They didn't believe me. Not really. I wanted to scream at them, tell them that it wasn't just nightmares, that I wasn't making it up. But what was the point? They didn't understand. That night, I made a decision. I wasn't going to run to their room anymore. I was tired of them looking at me like I was crazy, like I was just some scared little kid with overactive imagination. I needed to face it. I needed to know what it wanted. So I stayed in bed. The house was quiet, and even though every fiber of my being screamed for me to run, I stayed. The air was thick with tension, like something was waiting for me to close my eyes. And then, just like every other night, the shadow came. It was almost routine by now, the shape emerging from the wall, sliding closer and closer to the bed. But this time, I didn't pull the covers over my head. I didn't run. I sat up, trembling, but determined. The shadow stopped at the foot of my bed, towering over me like a dark storm cloud. My breath hitched in my throat as its form wavered, becoming more solid, more real. I know you're there. What do you want from me? The room felt colder, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, I heard it again, the whisper closer now, as if it was right beside me. Come closer. I shook my head, my fists clenched tight. No, you come closer. The shadow didn't move for a long time, just stood there, as if surprised by my defiance. and then, slowly, it started to shift. It moved around the bed, circling me, its form twisting and writhing like smoke in the air. My heart pounded in my chest, but I didn't back down. And then I saw something I hadn't seen before. A pair of glowing eyes, small, pale, and hollow, opened in the middle of the shadow's face. They were locked on me, and in that moment, I felt something I hadn't felt before. Not just fear, but something deeper. This thing, whatever it was, wasn't just a shadow. It wasn't just a figure haunting my room. After that night, I couldn't pretend anymore. I stopped eating, stopped playing, stopped pretending like everything was okay. I spent hours in my room, staring at the walls, waiting for it to come again. But now, it didn't only come at night. I started seeing it during the day, out of the corner of my eye. At school, while the teacher droned on about math, I'd catch a glimpse of it, standing at the back of the classroom, just watching me. At dinner, it would be there in the reflection of the glass door, waiting. It was always waiting, but I didn't tell anyone. Not anymore. What was the point? I began to wonder if maybe I was losing my mind, if maybe this was all just in my head. But then something happened that proved to me, without a doubt, that it was real. It was a Friday night. Mom and Dad had gone out to a friend's house, leaving me with a babysitter. Her name was Claire, and she was older, probably in her 20s, and completely uninterested in anything I said. She spent the whole night texting her friends and half watching TV while I sat on the couch, curled up in a ball, pretending to read a book. I kept glancing at the hallway, knowing that it was there, waiting in my room, waiting for me to be alone. Claire didn't notice anything strange. Why would she? She couldn't see it. After a while, she got up and told me she was going to the bathroom. She told me not to move from the couch, and I didn't argue. As soon as she disappeared down the hallway, the air in the house changed. The lights flickered. I looked down the dark hallway, and that's when I saw it. The shadow. Not in my room this time, but standing in the middle of the hallway, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. I could hear it now, the soft scraping of its feet on the wooden floor, the low whisper curling through the air. But then I realized something that made my blood run cold. The bathroom door was wide open, and Claire wasn't inside. I scrambled to my feet, backing up towards the front door, my eyes never leaving the shadow as it slid closer. "Claire?" I called out, my voice shaking. No answer. The shadow stepped into the light of the living room, its eyes burning brighter now. And behind it, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. A door. A black door standing in the middle of the hallway, where the wall should have been. The shadow stopped in front of the door, and for the first time, I heard it clearly. "Come closer. Open the door." I stared at it, my heart pounding in my ears. I didn't know what was behind that door, but I knew one thing for sure. If I opened it, I wasn't coming back. I stood there, staring at the shadow and the impossible door behind it, my legs frozen in place. The air felt heavy, thick with something dark and ancient, pressing down on my chest like I was being slowly suffocated. The whisper was louder now, echoing in my mind. "Come closer. Open the door." I could feel it pulling me, like invisible hands, dragging me toward the door. But I knew I couldn't open it. Whatever was behind that door wasn't something I was meant to see. Maybe it wasn't something anyone was meant to see. I took a step back, trying to break free from whatever force was keeping me there. But my feet felt like they were sinking into the floor. The shadow inched closer, its glowing eyes fixed on me, unblinking, as if it were waiting for me to give in. Then I remembered something, the one thing that always helped, even just a little. Mom's voice, her soft words whenever I was scared, telling me that nothing could hurt me if I stayed brave. I held on to that thought as tightly as I could and whispered under my breath, "You're not real. The shadow flickered, just for a moment. The whisper in my head faltered, growing softer. "You're not real," I said again, louder this time. My voice was shaking, but I didn't stop. "You can't hurt me." For a second, I thought it might actually be working. The shadow began to blur, like smoke dissipating in the wind. I could almost see the hallway behind it, the ordinary wooden floor where the door had been. My heart raced with hope. Maybe it was just a nightmare after all, maybe I was finally waking up. But then I made the mistake of blinking. In that single instant, the shadow surged forward, faster than it had ever moved before. It wrapped around me like cold, wet fog, and suddenly, I was no longer in my house. The room vanished. The hallway, the living room, everything around me dissolved into darkness. I was standing in front of the door now, the ancient, splintered wood looming over me like a towering wall. The symbols carved into it seemed to pulse, glowing faintly as if they were alive. I could feel the cold emanating from the door, seeping into my bones. Behind me, I heard the whisper again, closer than ever. "Open it. You're almost there." My hand moved on its own, rising toward the door handle, cold sweat running down my back. No matter how hard I tried to stop it, my fingers closed around the rough iron handle. It was freezing to the touch, but I couldn't let go. Something was making me open the door. The handle twisted with a creak, the sound echoing in the endless dark around me. The door began to swing open, and I was hit by a blast of icy wind. It smelled like damp earth, old wood, and something sour, something that made my stomach twist. I stepped back, my mind screaming at me to stop, to run, to do anything but open that door. But it was too late. The door swung open completely, revealing a darkness so thick it was like looking into a void. And in that darkness, I saw movement, shapes shifting, twisting, something slithering just beyond the threshold. Eyes, hundreds of them, gleamed from the darkness, watching me. And then I heard it, a sound like distant thunder, rumbling from deep within the void. But it wasn't thunder. It was something else, something alive, something waiting. I wanted to turn and run, to escape, but my legs wouldn't move. My hand still gripped the door handle, as if I was chained to it. The cold was unbearable now, sinking into my skin, into my bones. The whisper came again, but this time it was different. It wasn't coming from behind me. It was coming from inside the door, from the darkness. "Step through," it said, in a voice that sounded like 1,000 voices all speaking at once. "Join us." I knew without a doubt that if I stepped through that door, I would never come back. I would be lost in that darkness forever, just like Claire, just like whoever else had opened this door before me. But I couldn't stop my feet from moving. One step, then another. I was being pulled into the void, into that impossible, terrible place. I was almost through the door when I heard something. A voice, faint but familiar. "Liam, stop." It was Mom's voice. Suddenly, the darkness seemed to flicker, like a candle flame in the wind. I stopped, my foot hovering just above the threshold, my heart pounding in my chest. Mom's voice came again, louder this time. "Liam, come back." I turned around, and there she was, standing in the darkness behind me, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. She wasn't supposed to be here. None of this was supposed to be real. But there she was, reaching out to me. "I'm right here," she said, her voice breaking. "Come back. Please, come back." I don't know how, but her voice broke through the fog in my mind. My hand released the door handle, and I stumbled back, away from the door, away from the whispering darkness. The door slammed shut with a deafening bang, the symbols on its surface glowing brighter for a moment before fading into nothing. The shadow dissolved, the cold lifted, and suddenly, I was back in my living room. I gasped, trying to catch my breath, my body trembling. Mom wasn't there anymore. It had just been her voice, something or someone had saved me. But I knew it wasn't over. The door was gone, but the shadow wasn't. And whatever was behind that door, it was still waiting for me. The next few days passed in a blur. I barely left my room, my mind constantly racing, thinking about the door, the shadow, the voices. Mom and Dad thought I was sick, the stress of school or something else was getting to me. They didn't know the truth and I couldn't tell them. They wouldn't believe me anyway. But I knew the shadow wasn't gone. I could still feel it watching me, waiting. Every night, when the house grew quiet and dark, I would feel that familiar chill in the air, the same cold presence lurking just out of sight. I couldn't escape it. The shadow wasn't just in my room anymore. It was everywhere, at school, at home, even in my dreams. And the whisper, it was growing louder. One night, as I lay awake in bed, I heard the creak of the floorboards outside my room. At first, I thought it was Dad checking on me, or maybe just the house settling like it always did. But then I heard the whisper, "Come back." My heart raced as I sat up, my hands shaking. The door to my room slowly creaked open, and I saw it again, the shadow standing in the doorway, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. But this time it wasn't alone. Behind it, just barely visible in the darkness, I saw the outline of the door. The same splintered wood, the same glowing symbols. And I knew, deep down, that this time, it wouldn't let me go so easily. The door. Every time I thought about it, every time I saw it in my mind, it gnawed at me. This wasn't some fairy tale. This was real. There was a reason for it. A reason it kept coming back. A reason it wanted me. The more I tried to avoid thinking about it, the more the memory of that night pressed in on me. The shadow, the eyes, and, of course, the door standing where it didn't belong. The thing was, it didn't feel like some supernatural fantasy. It felt deliberate, like someone or something had placed it there on purpose. And that was the part that scared me the most. I spent the next few days in a daze, the world around me fading into the background. The whispers hadn't come back since that night, but I knew they were waiting. The door was waiting, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had only delayed something inevitable. Finally, I decided I couldn't run anymore. If I was going to understand what was happening, I had to face it. I had to figure out what the door really meant. One afternoon, when Mom and Dad were out, I snuck into the basement. It was the only place in the house I hadn't searched yet. The one place I avoided because of how cold and damp it always felt. There was something about that space that had never felt right to me, even before all this started. But now I wondered if maybe that was the point. The basement was dark and musty, filled with old boxes, tools, and things we'd forgotten we owned. I grabbed a flashlight and scanned the room, not really sure what I was looking for, but knowing I couldn't leave until I found it. As I moved deeper into the basement, I noticed something strange. A section of the wall where the bricks were slightly misaligned, as if someone had hastily patched it up. My heart started to race. I crouched down, running my hand over the uneven surface, and then I saw it. A small crack between the bricks, barely noticeable, but just wide enough to slip my fingers into. I hesitated for a moment, then pulled. The bricks shifted, revealing a gap. My hands were trembling as I widened the hole, pulling away more of the loose bricks. Behind them, there was a space, dark, cold, and deep, and inside that space, something glinted. I reached in, my fingers brushing against cold metal. When I pulled it out, I froze. It was an old key. The key was rusted, its edges worn smooth from years of disuse, but it was unmistakably a key. And it wasn't just any key, it was for that door. I didn't know how I knew, but I did. The same way I had felt the shadow watching me. The same way I had sensed the door was more than just a nightmare. This key was connected to it. Connected to everything. I sat there for a long time, staring at the key, trying to piece it all together. Why had the door appeared in my house? Why me? And what would happen if I used this key? You found it. My blood ran cold. The voice wasn't coming from inside my head anymore. It was coming from behind me. Slowly I turned, and there, in the corner of the basement, I saw it. The door. It was the same as before, splintered, ancient, the symbols carved into it glowing faintly. But this time it wasn't some hallucination or dream. It was real, standing in the basement like it had always been there. And now I had the key. I gripped it tightly, my knuckles white, my mind racing. I could feel the weight of everything pressing down on me. The cold, the dark, the unknown lurking behind that door. But I also felt something else, something far worse. Familiarity. This wasn't the first time the door had appeared. Memories I had buried long ago, flashes of my childhood, of rooms that felt wrong, of strange dreams I had convinced myself were just that, flooded back to me. And there, buried in the haze of those memories, was the image of this door. I didn't understand how, but it had been following me for a long time, waiting for the right moment. Suddenly, it all made sense. The door wasn't some supernatural portal to another world or a figment of my imagination. It was a trap designed specifically for me. But why? I had to know. With trembling hands, I approached the door, the key clutched tightly in my palm. The symbols carved into the wood seemed to shift and twist, the light around them dimming as I drew closer. My heart pounded in my chest, every instinct screaming at me to stop, to turn back, to run. But I couldn't. I had to understand. I slipped the key into the lock, my breath catching as the cold metal clicked into place. For a moment, everything was still. Then, with a deep, groaning creak, the door slowly swung open. The cold hit me first, sharp and biting, but not like before. This wasn't the cold of the basement or the shadow. This was something older, something that felt like it had been waiting for centuries. Beyond the door wasn't darkness, like I had expected. It was a room, a small, narrow room, with walls made of the same crumbling brick as the basement. And in the center of the room, there was a single object, a mirror. It wasn't an ordinary mirror. Its surface was dull, like the glass had been fogged over by time, and its frame was wrapped in the same twisted symbols that covered the door. But as I stepped closer, I realized something horrifying. The reflection in the mirror wasn't mine. The face staring back at me was twisted, distorted, like a version of me that had been left to rot in some forgotten place. Its eyes were hollow, its skin pale and stretched tight over bone, and its lips curled into a grin that didn't belong on any living thing. And then, without moving its lips, the reflection spoke. "I've been waiting for you, Liam." I stumbled back, my body shaking. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. But the reflection kept grinning, its hollow eyes locked on mine. "You should have never opened the door." It hit me then like a punch to the gut. The door wasn't just a trap, it was a gateway to something inside me, something I had buried deep and forgotten. And now that I had opened it, I couldn't close it again. I had let something out, something that wasn't going to let me go. I stood there, staring at the twisted reflection of myself in the mirror, feeling the weight of my mistake crushing down on me. The door had been a trap all along, a trap that I had walked right into. My reflection, if I could even call it that, grinned wider, its hollow eyes fixed on me like it was savoring the moment. "You belong here," it whispered, the voice seeping into my mind. "You've always belonged here." I couldn't move. The cold from the room seeped into my bones, locking me in place. My mind raced, searching for a way out, but the reflection was already stepping closer, its skeletal hand reaching out, as if ready to pull me through the mirror into whatever nightmare existed on the other side. And then I remembered the key. My hand shot to my pocket, fingers closing around the cold metal. I didn't know how, but something deep inside told me the key wasn't just for opening doors, it could close them too. The mirror seemed to flicker for a moment, the grin on the reflection faltering as it sensed what I was about to do. "You can't escape," it hissed, the voice now filled with fury. "You're mine." But I wasn't listening anymore. My body moved on instinct. I backed away from the mirror, still clutching the key, and stumbled toward the door. The cold grew stronger, like the room itself was trying to pull me back, but I fought through it. I reached the door, heart pounding, and slammed it shut. As soon as the door closed, the room plunged into darkness. For a second, I thought I was too late. But then, I jammed the key back into the lock, turning it as hard as I could. There was a loud click, and the air around me seemed to shudder, the walls trembling as if the house itself was being ripped apart. The cold vanished. The whispers stopped. I was back in the basement. I stumbled away from the door, gasping for breath, my body shaking uncontrollably. The door was still there, but it was different now. The symbols had stopped glowing, and the wood was splintered and rotted, as if it had aged 100 years in the span of seconds. It was over. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I didn't stop running until I was sure the house, the door, and whatever was behind it were far behind me. Mom and Dad never asked why I refused to go back into the basement. I think, deep down, they sensed something was wrong with that part of the house, even if they didn't understand it. We moved a few months later, and I never looked back. But I never forgot. I'm old now, sitting in a quiet house miles away from where it all happened. It's funny, the things you remember as you age. You'd think the memories of that night would fade, like so many others have, but they haven't. If anything, they've grown sharper, more vivid with time, as if the past is reaching out to remind me of something I've tried to forget. I can still see the door in my mind, as clear as the day I found it. I can still hear the whispers, the cold voice of my reflection telling me I belong there, on the other side. Sometimes, in my dreams, I find myself back in that basement, standing in front of the door, the key heavy in my hand. The fear never leaves me, no matter how many years pass. I've spent most of my life trying to understand what really happened that night. Was it real? Was it all in my head? I don't know, and maybe I never will. But what I do know is that I wasn't the first person to find that door, and I'm terrified that I won't be the last. I've thought about going back, about finding the old house and seeing if the door is still there. But every time I get close to the idea, something stops me. A cold chill, a faint whisper at the back of my mind, reminding me of what almost happened. I escaped once. I won't be so lucky again.